So Bob Harris is out today. He's traveling. He was at the Fantasy Expo. Some of you, I think, were probably there, and I know that a lot of those guys had a great time. So I was going to find a replacement, but I decided since most people were probably at the Fantasy Expo, I thought it would be just worthwhile to do a solo RSP cast. So we're going to cover a number of things, not in the normal feel it or fuck it format, but really instead we're going to talk about my thoughts on preseason football. And then from a fantasy perspective, players I'm changing my mind on, players that I'm holding firm on, players that I'm curious about and want to see more and are kind of looking forward to their unveiling from a dynasty perspective. And then also some thoughts on what coaches think about players and kind of my perspective on how they look at things that may help us detangle some of the crap that we hear or that's reported. Okay, so to begin preseason football, we had our first dose of that over this past week and this weekend, and I think everybody gets excited about that, and for good reason. It's fun to get a chance to watch these players play, but I think we need to remember that oftentimes, especially if you're a fantasy fan and you're on social media and you're watching experts like, say, Brian Baldinger review film, or Robert Griffin, or Kurt Benkert or Kurt Warner or whoever it is, former players, certainly they understand the game. Understanding the game of football is different than scouting football players. Some of them do pretty well with that. Some of them, have gaps in what they do. We all have different strengths and weaknesses. But what's fascinating to me is how much people get excited about certain plays that they see in preseason. For instance, Jalen Wright, the Miami Dolphins running back, he had a really nice reversal of field, and Brian Baldinger reviewed that, and I think you get thousands of people liking and retweeting this type of thing, and they get excited about Jalen Wright, and there's reasons to be excited about Jalen Wright. But when you watch that play, or a play like by Ben Sinnott working through the middle of the defense, on a pass play, or Caleb Williams running around in the pocket, I think a lot of times you have to understand that this is oftentimes these analysts' first true looks at these players. And they haven't spent a lot of time analyzing them or studying their games and knowing what they can or can't do. And so when you see a guy like Jalen Wright do a reversal of field and get a first down on the play, it's a pretty play. It's also something that you would see him do at Tennessee. So it's nothing vastly unusual, and you would expect him to be able to do a lot of that in an NFL preseason game in certain moments. It's really what you want to look for is how good his judgment is on a play-to-play basis, not whether he can make a reversal of field and show off his speed on one play. And that may display a little bit of a comfort level or in certain circumstances. But more than anything, it's a little bit inflated when you start seeing this stuff. So understand that when you see these analysts talk about players and hype them up, one, they're trying to get clicks. They're doing true analysis, but they're trying to get clicks, so they're going to be very enthusiastic about certain things. And two, this is oftentimes their first time looking at a player. So if you've read a scouting report like you see at the RSP, then you know that player's been examined over a course of a year or two, and a lot of the stuff that you're going to see in the preseason is stuff that you would expect them to do. So I think that's very important to understand. And then I think the next thing let's talk about is coach speak, because I'd say one of the more enlightening things I noticed this summer that was kind of amusing was seeing interviews with certain coaches. One of the best ones that I saw that was very revealing was Jim Harbaugh, who Sigmund Bloom and I were just talking before this show, and he was joking around about how maybe now with Pete Carroll gone, that maybe Jim Harbaugh is a bit of a slot machine in terms of you never know what you're going to get when you put the microphone to his face. It's like you're pulling a lever, and you're either going to get lemons or you're going to get three gold bars, or it might be a mishmash of everything. It might be a fruit salad for all you know. And you don't know whether he's fucking with you or whether he's telling you the truth. and I think that there's something to be said with that. But when he was interviewed and asked about Quentin Johnston, one of the things that he said was that Johnston was good at tracking and catching the football and was really good at that. And if he meant that, then that tells you that he really isn't watching the player closely. He's looking, and head coaches are obsessed with scheme. They're the front-facing managers of the team. They're looking at a lot of different things, and they're just presuming that a player is good at some of those things, or he's looking at it situationally and saying he's good. Maybe he's seen him on a bunch of slants, and crossing routes and felt good about that. Or maybe he's seen him get the results on some plays in practice and feels good about that. But it's clear that he hasn't gone back to watch the film and look at all the drops and mishandling of targets that Johnston has had since college and early in pros, where he mistracks the football on jump back type of plays that would be expected of him with a good quarterback like Justin Herbert throwing the ball in those tight coverage scenarios. So I saw that, and it made me think, if he really thinks that, then we have to remember that sometimes these coaches, they're good at certain aspects of football, but doesn't make them all knowing. And my specialty is more about wide receiver, running back, quarterback, and tight end techniques and concepts and skills. That's what I've studied for 20 years. Jim Harbaugh has probably spent most of his time looking at schemes, schematics, how you work with the media, how you motivate players, how you put together game plans. He was a pro quarterback, so he certainly understands, good quarterbacking, but he's also looking for results from receivers. He's not trying to coach them on process. That was not what his frame of reference or point of view is. And then I looked at someone like Gutenkist, the GM for the Packers, and they were asking him about Marshawn Lloyd. And they asked the running back coach of the Packers about Marshawn Lloyd, and they said that ball security, was a concern with him. He's had fumbles, but it's an easy thing to correct. That's what they said. Well, I thought that as well. And I was, it's over this past summer, and it's really this past year and a half, I've been thinking about changing how I grade running backs in the rookie scouting portfolio for ball security. Whether I'm awarding too many points for ball security, and meaning if you're not good at it, that maybe you're losing too many points. And I thought about doing a study and going back to see whether that I should make that change and be a little bit more lenient and award those points in other areas of my evaluation. And so I went back and I looked at 6 years worth of top 60 fantasy running backs from 2018, I think, through 2023. Okay, that's 6 years. And I looked at, what the grades were in the RSP for ball security for every player in the top 60 each of those years. And what I found was that, only 10% of the back, if you were a back that had a ball security grade below committee level, meaning that that your techniques were not strong in terms of how you secure the ball, and that you were averaging worse than one fumble for every 61 touches in college. If you had that issue, only 10% of those players with that issue were fantasy assets, meaning they were only 10% of them were RB2s, RB3s, RB4s, or even RB5s. Only 10% of them. Only 3% of them were elite running backs, top 3 ever made to the top 3. So you basically 90% of the backs that made the top 60 over the past 6 years had a ball security rate better than one fumble per 60 touches. Okay, And that's a low ball security rate number, okay? So if you can't even do committee level, there's some trouble. Well, one of the players who was below committee level in their fumble rate during their college career was Marshawn Lloyd. So how easy is it going to be for him to fix it? It's not impossible, you know. One of my longtime customers, Jacob Blackburn, hey Jake, talked about, didn't Tiki Barber correct his, and he had a low fumble rate. He did, but he's an exceptional case when you look at, you look at the historical data that we see from any sample size. Sony Michel was another example, but did he really become a fantasy asset? Injuries may have contributed to that, and there are other factors. So what I'm giving you as a correlation isn't perfect, but it does tell you that ball security does have some gravity to it. And Marshawn Lloyd's issues aren't just ball security related as well. He's a guy who tends to bounce plays around. And there was a play that, Amar, one of my favorite listeners, Damar, who I just on his podcast with the Packers this week, talked about, Amr was telling me about it, is that he was saying that, he was pointing out on Twitter that Marshawn Lloyd had a, bounce to play, that, and how, that was something I noticed a lot with his game. But in that particular situation, it was logical and called for. So I'm not looking for just how often a player bounces plays. I'm looking for whether it was a good or bad decision based on the down and distance, the game management kind of scenario that would be expected from a back, because running backs do have to process information effectively and be good managers of the game, better than what people realize. So processing is very important. So when you look at the coaches and you see that, coaches and GMs talking about these players, and they're saying things about their scouting, things that would be on a scouting report, they kind of contradict what I've seen, or their assumptions of what will work kind of contradict what the data is showing me right now. So it's something I want to continue to explore, and I'm hopeful that I'll continue to find things that maybe contradict what coaches say, and maybe play out, and maybe able to drive some ideas into the community that might be more worthwhile, and help fantasy GMs look at what a coach says and goes, let me take that with a grain of salt, because they obviously haven't studied that area. Just kind of help identify blind spots, so that some of the things that can be said in the media end up being a little bit more fluff, and what the fluff is. Preseason football. We saw Jalen Wright, we saw Ben Sano, we saw Marshawn Lloyd, we saw a touchdown from Jermaine Burton, plays like that. All those plays that I just mentioned, or, players I just mentioned, and they had some plays that people noticed. They were all things that I would say, based on their tape, they did what they were supposed to do. And those were good moments like that. It's, the value of that is that you get to see them, that they're at least were comfortable enough in some situations to play at the level that you've seen on tape. Okay? And there's nothing wrong with that. That's good. That's a positive. I just wouldn't inflate that positive to a point where you're going to get overly excited about it. In contrast, I see people going off on someone like, say, Stetson Bennett. And let's understand that Stetson Bennett is not going to be leaned on in fantasy football this year unless a couple players get hurt. Okay, but he had, 4 interception performance. People got off about that. Or Trey Lance and his, in his performance, he had some good skill. He had some moments as a runner and a scrambler. And then there's people criticizing what he did, where he didn't have a sterling game at certain moments. I didn't watch that game, but I didn't watch either game. And I'll tell you this what I think about this, though, is that with preseason football, when you have players like Bennett who didn't play all last year and was gone from the team all last year, and he's coming back to play now after he had some issues that he needed to take time off. When you take that much time off and now you're getting back onto an NFL field and it's your first time on an NFL field, you should expect some rust, and you should expect a bad performance, especially at the hardest position in football. So I wouldn't look at him and make the conclusions that people are making without the context of that he hasn't really been around a facility for most of the year. And with Trey Lance, I mean, again, he's a young player. He's younger than some of the rookies that have come into the league this year at the position. And he's going to have ups and downs. And he's had very little playing time. And he's skipped a couple levels. So is the ability there? Is like the athletic ability, the arm, the moments of reading the field? Yeah, there's a lot of promise to be capitalized on. But I would argue that if we look back at Jordan Love about 3 years ago and put him on the field at certain moments, you're going to see ups and downs with him too. And I believe that was probably the case. So it is a process with quarterbacks. I would not overreact to young quarterbacks and what their performances look like in the preseason. But, with that said, and we talk about training camp and then just, training camp, preseason, I would say, the preseason has value in this respect. If you have a young player who's at the edge of fighting for a roster spot and they look comfortable on the field and they're making good plays and they're not making mistakes and they're taking advantage of opportunities afforded them. Dejon Edwards, the Georgia running back, fighting for a roster spot. He had a nice play on a draw. It was a wide open hole, but he looked good, with what he did there. You see plays like that. If they look comfortable, if they're able to create, that's a positive, and it's helpful for those young players who are trying to make a roster spot that you might want to keep an eye on them and monitor them as potential opportunities to leverage if injuries occur and suddenly they're the unknown who's going to get more playing time. That's valuable in the preseason. I think to an extent, utilization data, like what Dwayne McFarland does at Fantasy Life, can be valuable in the preseason, at least to help you understand where the scheme's trying to go. It's not always going to be a 100% correlation, but you get a sense of what the offensive coordinators are trying to do, and then that means what roles are going to be targeted more often, and maybe what that means for some of the players that might be in those roles. But, from a scouting report standpoint, you're not going to see much different most of the time from these players than what you see in the RSP or in any other scouting report that does, accurate work in terms of assessing a player's strengths and weaknesses. There's going to be some opportunities to see improvement with a player, but I would say most of that's going to be, have more gravity in the regular season than in the preseason. So keep that in mind. So let's talk about some players that, I'm probably changing my mind on a bit from a fantasy perspective. DeVon Achane, Miami Dolphins running back. He's someone that's certainly moving up my boards. And I think that we're going to see more of an even split between him and Raheem Mostert this year. You saw Mostert being more of Mr. Inside and Achane being more Mr. Outside, and certainly he ran draw plays and some of those DeAndre Swift open field specials in the middle of the field that the Dolphins like to create those kind of kick return opportunities in through big gaps that movement and motion and different types of condensed looks can create. And certainly they're going to do more of that with Achane. But I also think they're going to give him more opportunities to work inside and on traditional looks as well. And we'll see Mostert and Achane probably have more of an even split, and I wouldn't even be surprised if there's a little bit more of an even distribution of the same roles with these guys, kind of like Tony Pollard and Tyjae Spears. So Achane's moving up my board. I think I moved him slightly above Mostert over the weekend, and I think that he's going to end up being a valuable fantasy asset, even if his touch, his volume isn't like what you'd see from Derrick Henry, Saquon Barkley, even Bijan Robinson. Cooper Kupp. I'm moving Cooper Kupp back up. The reports from camp are saying that he just looks like he's back into the shape that we, peak form. And with Puka Nacua getting hurt, yeah, he may be back week 1, but I think we're starting to get hip to the idea that being healthy enough to be on the field and execute assignments is different than being healthy enough to produce at a high level at your top level of athletic skill. And I think that's and I think Kupp, I think that Nacua may have maybe 2 to 4 weeks where he's not at his best, maybe longer, but I would say at a minimum 2 to 4 weeks where you're thinking, okay, maybe not quite there yet, and that means that Kupp will probably get a lot more of the love from Matthew Stafford, along with distributing some of those other looks to Demarcus Robinson and the like. Javonte Williams came into camp in great shape, lost some weight. When you have a coach say he looks like a totally different player, and you've got other people substantiating that fact that we trust, like Cecil Lammey, I think does a good job of covering the Broncos, obviously. I think that Williams is poised to be the man this year in Denver. It doesn't mean that I think Denver's going to have a great ground game unless Bo Nix is great out of the gate. And I think Nix is kind of a sleeper in 2 quarterback leagues, in the sense that if he manages the game as well as he's shown early on, which I don't think he's going to do it quite as well as he's done in the preseason, because preseason is more like a little bit of college football. Once the regular season hits, you're going to see more complexity. You're going to see the top athletes all together on the field. And in preseason, oftentimes you see some of the top athletes on the field together, but not everybody. And that's where it gets overwhelming for rookies, is when they get into that scenario in September, when suddenly everything gets ratcheted up and every player on the field would have been by far or very close to being the best player on the team that they were facing in the SEC or the ACC or any college division. So if Nix can somehow really show smart management of the game the way that he did at Oregon, then that could carry over where the Broncos might have a chance to run the ball enough that Williams really outpaces his value. But I still moved him up enough that I think he can be a low-end starter this year, and with some upside, and that's a positive, where I wasn't as sure. Chris Olave, I've always loved Chris Olave's game, but I was worried about Derek Carr. I was worried about the offensive line. But the more I think about Clint Kubiak's system, the more I think that they're going to add extra gaps for the run game to help get Alvin Kamara going. Another player that I'm kind of bumped up a little bit after legal issues last year that had to be a distraction for him. You have to think about that and being a little banged up, and then lacking a tackle. Really lacking 2 tackles for New Orleans. I think they've shored that up enough, and maybe helped out a little bit with the tight ends that they're going to run through this scheme, that they're going to get Kamara going again, and I think that's going to help Derek Carr. And I think Carr and Olave, while they weren't working great together last year, I'm going to have faith that just like him and Crabtree and him and Amari Cooper, that we're going to see some connections that will be some improvement. It may not be ideal ever, but I think that we'll see enough improvement that Olave will return to a form that people expect. He may not grow to the expectation people had where he's like, top 10 wide receiver, but I think top 15 is very possible with him. DK Metcalf, I'm getting excited about. Mainly it's because in Ryan Grubb's offense, they're talking about moving him around the the formation enough to try and work ways to get him open and give him a lot of high volume looks. And so if they want to get him running and doing that, while I'm a little concerned about his body type and injury, so far he's been healthy throughout his career. So why not take the chance on a career year for Metcalf? I think there's a very good possibility that can be the case, and you're going to get him at a reasonable value at this point. Ainias Smith, the rookie out of Texas A&M, who I really liked what I saw on tape, has just started slow in camp with the Eagles. Johnny Wilson has been more intriguing as an athlete. With Barris Campbell hurt once again, I think Ainias Smith is going to need a year or two. And if he can hang on to a roster spot or be on the practice squad and not get snapped up by somebody else and get a chance to grow in this offense, maybe there's a shot for him to develop into, a contributor that they anticipated with him. So those are some of the guys that I'm changing my mind on. Guys I'm holding firm on, well, we talked about Marshawn Lloyd. I'm holding firm that I think A.J. Dillon, he's arrived in great shape. He's a bit of an underrated player, but fantasy players don't like him because he's not super fast or super explosive, but he's a powerful guy who can catch. He runs with good vision and decision making, and I wouldn't be surprised that if Lloyd reminds me of like Tank Bigsby last year, where everybody went gaga over Tank Bigsby, and you realize that Bigsby, just like a lot of players I talk about, what they show in camp, what they show in preseason is really just a small window of what you see in college. And the preseason is a lot like the college game. So once they get to the real NFL season, then you start to see the jump that they are going to have to make. And at that point, he couldn't make that jump. His game just self-destructed. He couldn't catch the ball. He couldn't hold on to the ball. He couldn't make the right decisions with interior plays that he should have kept inside, and he needed a year. Now I'm a little higher on Bigsby, hoping that he's gained some confidence and figured out what to do. But I'm worried that Marshawn Lloyd is in the same situation because he has similar issues as a runner, and I think that you're gonna wind up. This is a guy that you probably wish you waited a year on. You're going to need to be patient with him. I think he can do it, but we're going to take it year by year, and I think you want him to prove it before you get over your skis on him. Tyrone Tracy, another example that a lot of people are talking about him in camp. They're excited because you see the speed, you see the ability to break some tackles. He can catch the ball reasonably well as a dump-off receiver. They love the idea that he was a former receiver, so there's projection of what he can offer in that area of his game, even though on tape it wasn't as strong as people would think. And so he's someone that I would say you're going to see when the lights come on, mistakes. I would expect that from him, that he's going to make mistakes, that you realize Devin Singletary's a man, and Eric Gray may end up being the junior Devin Singletary, kind of mini-me version of that, with Tracy getting used early on and then seeing mistakes that they go, he's not ready yet. That's my fear. If he can overcome that, then he may be the sleeper everybody's talking about this year, but I think he's a little bit of an overhyped sleeper. I've got concerns about him that you're not going to see right now, just like that Tyrone Bigsby effect we just broached. The guy I'm still firm on that in a good way is Xavier Worthy, especially now with Marquise Brown hurt. Worthy's going to get enough touches underneath that I think he's going to be valuable for fantasy GMs. Mike, I wonder, everybody talks about him being able to really stretch the defense, and that they haven't had anybody to really stretch a defense in Kansas City. And I'm thinking, I don't think it's as much about how speedy a guy is all the time as much as what's the scheme? What are the schemes that the defenses are playing against the Kansas City Chiefs? Because that's really what drove things. They had speedy guys who could win, even if they didn't have Tyreek Hill. Okay? And even if you have a top-end speedster, if you're playing cover 2 and you're playing it high enough, even Tyreek Hill isn't going to beat you on a regular basis in that against those looks. So I'm wondering just how effective Xavier Worthy is going to be in those scenarios. I think you're going to see some big plays out of him, and he and Mahomes are going to connect. But I don't think it's going to be as rampant of a change as people hype it to be. So I think he'll be a good player. I think he'll be a fantasy starter in three receiver lineups, maybe even a wide receiver 2 this year. I think eventually he could be a wide receiver 1 in this league. I think he's got that Deshaun Jackson-like talent. I just don't know if it's going to blossom right away or if opposing coverages are going to give that opportunity to him as often to be that Deshaun Jackson difference maker in the vertical game. So let's talk about players that I'm curious about. We'll end it that way. These aren't players that I have much to say about. They're more players that I'm just interested to see how they're used in their offenses, and I might be seeing myself adding them early in the year or trading for them or elevating them into my starting lineups if I have them in Dynasty. Rashid Shaheed, last year I wrote about him saying that he could be the difference in the Saints offense if they had Michael Thomas and Olave and him all together, but then the offensive line just couldn't support Derek Carr, and that made the deep passing game problematic. And Shaheed had a good year, but Thomas couldn't stay healthy, and it was just kind of a disaster offensively where everything didn't click. But Shaheed seems to continue. It seems that he's continuing to grow, and I just want to see how complete of a route runner he is at early this year. He might be an early trade candidate, a guy to acquire, because if he's fully blossomed in year 3, that could be exciting. Jonathan Mingo, everybody gave this guy up for dead after 1 year. This is just the whole, what are you doing for me lately or right now type of dynamic with rookies and young players. And I'd say with Mingo, the size, the tracking ability, he's fast enough to be able to get downfield on play action and win the ball in tight coverage. But a lot of that has to come down to getting a rapport with the quarterback, being on the same page with how you look at coverage, getting a little more sophistication in tight coverage against top defenders. And that took some time. He could be kind of an young Anquan Bolden type of presence for a team if he really gets it all to click. And so far, he's had a strong camp. So we'll see. Can he be wide receiver 3 on this team? Xavier Legette is certainly a guy they're going to try and push onto the field. But can Legette stay healthy? Can Legette be more than just a schemed up player where you're throwing screens and RPOs to? Or the occasional crossing route or fade? Or can he be a little bit more of a threat as a full, as a well-rounded route runner? And I think that Mingo might be able to sneak in there. He's a guy I just want to watch and see if that's the case. And might be, again, a candidate you trade for if you see good things early on. Cedric Tillman, another guy I liked out of Tennessee, Cleveland Browns. They traded for Jerry Jeudy. I just don't believe in Jerry Jeudy anymore, just as a side note. I don't think the guy can stay healthy. I don't think that the Broncos wanted to get rid of him for a while, and they couldn't. They couldn't find a deal that was worthwhile. I think Jeudy has some very good route skills, but he just strikes me as a player who maybe just felt like he arrived. And he's good enough. He could be a terrific player, but maybe he has settled for being a good player. And I don't have anything to really totally substantiate that other than just his performances at this point. Okay? Not anything that anybody has said about him. I'm just kind of putting 2 and 2 together, and maybe it turns out that I'm thinking I'm putting 2 together get 4, but it's actually a different equation, and I'm wrong about it. So I'm more than, I want to freely put out there that, I may not know what I'm talking about with Jeudy, and I hope I'm wrong about it because I really loved what I saw of him in Alabama. I saw him as a Reggie Wayne type of player. Can he develop into that in Cleveland? I think Cleveland's kind of a weird place for football at this point. I don't think I'm more curious about Tillman. I think Tillman's the guy who kind of could take over for Amari Cooper at some point. Maybe not be as good of a route runner, but at the very least, I think he can be a better version of Josh Palmer. So I'm curious how that goes. I've always liked Olamide Zaccheaus, and I think that there was a point where observers in Washington Commanders camp were like, Olamide Zaccheaus is the guy on the roster bubble. He's not going to make it to the team. Now I'm starting to see, as the preseason goes on, Olamide Zaccheaus seems to be a guy that they're trying to find ways to get on the field and use more often because, as my buddy Drew Lieberman would say, who coached Zaccheaus, he said this guy should be a starter in the league, but they look at his size, they look at his draft capital, and they just kind of pass him over for other people and label him, and they shouldn't. And I think Zaccheaus is someone that maybe gets a chance in Washington to be wide receiver 3 at some point. I know Luke McCaffrey is, had a good camp. They're still invested in Dotson, who could still be good. Obviously, McLaurin is the top guy there. But I think Zaccheaus may be the wide receiver 4 and maybe get the push to be a wide receiver 3 with good play. Keon Coleman. I like Coleman. We'll end on that note with him. He's, I think that they're looking at him and realizing the reliability of his hands, that some of the things that he can do as a route runner underneath, and what he can do after the catch are strong enough that maybe they're going to give him some early shots to play, and if he can show that he can handle it early, that they'll continue to try and expand his game on the field. So he's one of the guys that could go either way for sure. It could go really strong for him rookie year, or they could peel it back and say, too much too soon. Let's not get too excited about him. We gave him his chance. Now he needs a little bit more time. We're not gonna go too strong to the hole with him year 1. So again, those are I think 5 guys that I'm really curious about, and all of them turned out to be wide receivers at this stage. So I could add Dylan Lobby in there as another one that I'm really curious about. I'm really curious about J.K. Dobbins if he can just stay healthy. But that's enough. Again, rookie scouting portfolio available, $21.95. If you really want prepared looks at these rookies, and especially guys that you can look back on and use this resource for free agency, go to mattwaldman.com. It's by far the best thing that I offer in this space. And I'm heading into year 20 with it. You're going to get takes on players that you're going to look back on and go, you'll look at player and go, I don't know who this guy is. Let me look him up. And you look at him and you see my ranking of him, and you'll see really what I've written about him and go, okay, he's in a situation where that could work out and be worthwhile for your waivers. And then if you're interested in the dynasty rankings and projections, I do a service for that, $24.95. You can get it at mattwaldman.com. I just put out the first update in August. I'll have a second update in August in probably a couple weeks. You get, win now and long-term build rankings up to about 360 players. There's probably 400 to 450 players on the cheat sheet, but I rank the first 360 of them. I do then, and it's all tiered and color-coded, and I have little symbols that with a key that tell you what I think about some of the players in a shorthand sense. And I update this multiple times during the year, and in addition to that, you get a linear ranking where I have commentary for all of those 350 plus players. And then there's projections that I update throughout the year, and I call them 2-year dynasty rankings. They're really 1 year, but I give you your service runs through June of the following year so that you get at least my look at June 2025. So you get a part of a second year as kind of a tease to say, all right, this is where I think. And I do have a section where I have a year or two, and I'll start filling in some of my thoughts on players who I think are going to stay as the year progresses for 2025. But it's not going to be a complete 2-year projection. It just makes no sense with all the changes that happen in the NFL to really do that. But I do account for okay, here's players that I think may stick to the roster, and you can see that in year 2. And so I'll start doing that a little bit more later in the year. But again, $24.95 for that, $21.95 for the draft guide. It's a great 1-2 combination. Probably comparable with some of the websites that you would purchase fantasy content from. And I can tell you that I give a ton of detail, and it's based on film study. So check that out. Thank you again, everyone, for checking in and getting a chance to listen to this. And we'll get Bob back next week. I didn't try to Wally Pip him this week, though I tried to lure Bloom in, but I think Bloom was scared of Bob Harris. I don't think he's scared of him, but he has a lot of respect for him. Bob probably bribed him. Anyway, have a good night.